The Star Council had governed known space for nearly 5,000 cycles, its members drawn from civilizations that had risen, expanded, and crushed rivals long before humanity had discovered faster-than-light theory. And when the agenda item labeled Sol System appeared on the Chamber's holographic agenda, it was treated as a formality, a minor compliance review for a newly contacted species occupying a single inhabited planet with limited colonial reach. And the delegates expected boredom, not history, as observers projected population figures, economic output, and military estimates that painted humans as clever but insignificant, a species still bound emotionally to one world, fractured by internal politics, and technologically dependent on outdated frameworks. Yet even as dismissive murmurs filled the chamber, subtle warning flags flickered unnoticed in the data streams. Anomalies buried under averages, growth curves that refused to behave normally, response times that were statistically impossible, and cultural indicators that made no sense to alien psychology, but arrogance has a way of blinding even the most ancient minds. And so the Council proceeded, authorizing a routine pressure protocol, a combination of trade restrictions, navigational controls, and a demand that humanity submit to Council oversight for regional stability, a demand that had bent hundreds of lesser species into compliance within days. Yet when the message was transmitted to Earth, the response did not come immediately, nor did it come in the expected tone of confusion, fear, or appeasement. Instead, there was silence, not the panic kind, but the deliberate kind, the kind that unsettles predators more than resistance ever could. And while Council analysts debated whether the humans even understood the ultimatum, Earth was already in motion, not with fleets or threats, but with coordination, as data flowed between civilian networks, military commands, scientific institutions, and diplomatic corps in a level of synchronization the Council had never observed in a supposedly divided species. And within hours, humans had mapped Council communication architectures, analyzed voting behavior patterns across species, and reconstructed centuries of political leverage from public archives the Council had assumed no outsider could contextualize. And when the human response finally arrived, it was short, polite, and devastatingly precise, acknowledging the Council's authority, rejecting its jurisdiction, and outlining, point by point, the legal contradictions, enforcement limitations, and strategic risks inherent in attempting to coerce Sol. Each sentence accompanied by supporting data that only an insider civilization should have possessed. And as the message played across the Council chamber, the mood shifted from irritation to confusion, then to something colder, as delegates realized the humans were not guessing. They were citing internal precedents, confidential rulings, and historical compromises thought forgotten. And before the Council could respond, secondary reports began flooding in from border systems near Sol, where monitoring stations experienced unexplained sensor degradation, navigation drift, and communication lag. Not attacks, not sabotage, just subtle failures that disrupted operations without violating any treaties. And as technicians scrambled to stabilize systems, analysts began to notice the pattern. Every disruption coincided perfectly with human shipping movements, research deployments, and civilian traffic, all operating legally, transparently, and yet with an efficiency that bordered on impossible. And when one Council admiral suggested show of force to reassert authority, simulations were run, and that was when panic first took hold, because every model, no matter how optimistic, ended the same way, not with human defeat, but with cascading uncertainty, command fragmentation, and unacceptable losses, driven not by superior firepower, but by human adaptability. The ability to change variables faster than predictive systems could update, and as the Council recessed into emergency session, whispers spread to the chamber, old myths resurfaced, ancient warnings recorded by precursor civilizations about species that evolved under extreme conditions, species that learned to thrive in chaos, to weaponize unpredictability, and to treat existential threat not as a crisis, but as a problem to be solved. And for the first time in its long history, the Star Council began to question whether the authority had just encountered something it could not intimidate, could not outmaneuver, and might not survive provoking, all because one planet of humans had chosen not to panic, not to submit, and not to reveal how far ahead they already were, setting in motion a realization that would ripple across the galaxy, that the balance of power had quietly shifted, and that Earth, long dismissed as insignificant, was about to become the most dangerous variable the Council had ever faced. The emergency session stretched far longer than protocol allowed. Counselors arguing in hushed, clipped tones as projections shifted and recalculated. Each new data model making the situation worse, not better, because the more variables they added, the more the simulations diverged into chaos. And chaos was something the Star Council had spent millennia eliminating from its equations. Yet humanity seemed to generate it effortlessly, not through recklessness, but through deliberate, disciplined unpredictability. And as analysts compared historical cases, they found no precedent for a single planet species exerting this level of systemic pressure without firing a shot, which unsettled the chamber far more than open aggression would have. Meanwhile, on Earth, there was no public broadcast, no dramatic announcement, no mobilization visible to civilian eyes. Only a quiet tightening of routines as shipping schedules adjusted by fractions of a second, power grids rerouted redundancies that had never before been activated, and research facilities shifted from theoretical work to applied readiness, not because panic had spread, but because humans treated preparation as habit. And while the Council debated sanctions, blockades, and symbolic force, their own member states began reporting internal disturbances, economic forecasting errors, delayed resource shipments, and data. Discrepancies traced back to human trade partners operating entirely within Council law, exploiting loopholes that no one had bothered to close because no one had ever imagined a species young enough to still remember its First World War could master interstellar bureaucracy so completely. And as frustration mounted, a senior counselor from an ancient avian civilization requested historical archives be opened, citing obscure precursor records. And what emerged chilled the chamber: accounts of civilizations that rose late, fast, and sideways, species that evolved on unstable worlds where survival demanded adaptability over elegance, cooperation under pressure, and the ability to plan for failure as a default condition. And the descriptions matched humanity with disturbing accuracy, noting especially the trait the precursors had warned against provoking: escalation restraint, the tendency to hold back overwhelming capability until the opponent had fully committed to a losing course. And as that realization spread, fear began to replace arrogance, because the Council understood force, intimidation, and hierarchy, but it did not understand an opponent that refused to play by those instincts. And when a follow-up transmission from Earth arrived, even more restrained than the first, politely requesting clarification on enforcement mechanisms and timelines, while subtly pointing out that several Council fleets were already operating beyond optimal logistical ranges, the chamber fell silent, because humans were no longer reacting. They were steering, guiding the Council's own decisions by revealing consequences just slowly enough to avoid triggering unified retaliation. And at that moment, as multiple delegates checked private channels filled with urgent messages from their home systems, the truth settled in with terrifying clarity. This was no longer about one planet resisting authority. This was about a species that had learned how to turn complex systems against themselves. And the Star Council, ancient and powerful though it was, found itself facing a problem it had not evolved to handle: a calm, patient civilization that did not need dominance to win, only time, foresight, and the willingness to let its opponents exhaust themselves. And somewhere deep in the Council predictive cores, an unthinkable probability crossed a threshold into plausibility, that the humans of Earth were not merely challenging the existing order, but were quietly positioning themselves to replace it, not through conquest, but through competence. And that realization sent a ripple of unease through every delegate present, because panic, once it begins at the top, has a way of spreading faster than any fleet ever could. As the Star Council's internal unrest deepened, fractures long hidden beneath centuries of enforced unity began to surface, because panic has a way of revealing truths that stability keeps buried. And while public channels projected calm authority, private transmissions told a different story of member worlds questioning directives, delaying compliance, and quietly hedging their loyalties, all while Earth remained conspicuously silent, not withdrawing, not advancing, simply continuing its normal operations with unsettling precision. And that silence became its own form of pressure, because every hour that passed without escalation allowed human influence to compound, trade routes subtly rerouting through soul-aligned networks, independent systems adopting human technical standards because they were more efficient and even council research institutes referencing human data models because they produce better predictions, and as analysts attempted to isolate the source of this cascading influence, they discovered an uncomfortable truth. Humanity had not centralized control, it had distributed competence, embedding decision-making across civilian, military, and scientific domains in ways that made disruption nearly impossible, because there was no single node to strike, no throne to topple, no command structure that could be decapitated without triggering automated adaptation. And this realization triggered the Council's greatest fear, that even if force were applied successfully, there would be no clean victory, only prolonged instability, attrition, and loss of legitimacy. Meanwhile, on Earth, the human leadership did convene, but not in grand chambers or ceremonial halls, rather in layered, redundant networks where elected officials, military planners, economists, and scientists spoke candidly, reviewed projections, and adjusted posture, not asking whether they could win, but how to avoid unnecessary collapse of the wider galactic ecosystem, because humans understood something the Council had forgotten, that dominance without stability was just delayed failure. And when reports arrived that several Council member worlds had independently opened unofficial communication channels with Earth seeking guidance rather than negotiation, the human response was measured and consistent, offering transparency, technical assistance, and legal clarification without demanding allegiance, a strategy that alarmed the Council more than open rebellion ever could, because loyalty born from utility was harder to break than loyalty enforced by fear, and as this slow realignment unfolded, a faction within the Council finally pushed for decisive action, authorizing a limited enforcement fleet to demonstrate authority near the Sol periphery, carefully framed as a peacekeeping exercise. Yet the moment the fleet crossed into the monitored zone, human systems reacted not with weapons fire, but with information, flooding shared networks with real-time risk assessments, collision probabilities, energy load projections, and legal citations outlining the fleet's exposure, vulnerabilities, and the catastrophic diplomatic fallout of misstep. And as human-civilian traffic continued to pass calmly to the same space, unaffected and unconcerned, the fleet's commanders faced a paralyzing dilemma, because any aggressive move would be recorded, contextualized, and broadcast in ways that would fracture Council unity beyond repair. And when the fleet withdrew under the justification of recalibration, the damage was already done, because the galaxy had watched and had seen the Council blink, not in fear of weapons, but in fear of consequences it could no longer control. And in that moment, the panic reached its peak, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and pervasive, the kind that settles into ancient institutions when they realize the rules they enforce no longer guarantee relevance. And as delegates returned to their chambers, avoiding one another's gaze, the unspoken consensus formed that humanity was no longer a problem to be managed, but reality to be adapted to, a species that shocked the entire Star Council not by roaring its power, but by demonstrating that it understood the galaxy better than the galaxy understood itself. And that realization marked a true turning point. Because once panic gives way to reluctant respect, history has already changed, and the Council knew, deep down, that one planet of humans had just rewritten the balance of the stars without firing a single shot. The aftermath of the fleet's withdrawal triggered a cascade of reactions across known space, not explosive, not dramatic, but deeply destabilizing, as member worlds quietly adjusted their policies, slowed compliance with Council mandates, and began consulting human legal frameworks and logistical models as reference points rather than anomalies. And this subtle shift was more dangerous to the old order than rebellion, because it signaled erosion of belief, the silent understanding that the Council was no longer the sole axis of competence. And as panic settled into permanence within the upper echelons, emergency committees were formed to analyze humanity not as a threat, but as a phenomenon. Yet every attempt to define humans within existing categories failed, because they were neither conquerors nor supplicants, neither isolationists nor expansionists, but something far more unsettling, a civilization optimized for systems thinking, born on a chaotic world where uncertainty was not a flaw but a constant. And that upbringing had shaped their institutions, their technologies, and even their diplomacy, which favored resilience over elegance and redundancy over display. And while the Council's analysts argued, Earth continued to do what it had always done best: refine, iterate, and prepare, not for war, but for inevitability, as infrastructure projects quietly expanded capacity. Shipyards produce modular vessels adaptable to multiple mission profiles, and research teams integrated alien science into human frameworks with alarming speed, not stealing, not reverse engineering aggressively, but understanding deeply, translating alien principles into human problem-solving language. And when a delegation of mid-tier council species formally requested human mediation in a long-standing territorial dispute, bypassing the council entirely, the request sent shockwaves through the chamber because it was the first public acknowledgement that authority had shifted. And when Earth accepted, not as ruler but as facilitator, the contrast was devastating. Human mediators resolved in weeks what the council had failed to manage in centuries, using transparent incentives, adaptive agreements, and enforcement mechanisms that relied on shared benefit rather than threat. And observers took note because humans did not posture, did not moralize. They simply solved the problem. And with every such success, panic within the council transformed into something heavier, an existential dread, the realization that their institution was not being attacked. It was being outperformed, and that was a threat no fleet could counter. And as internal reports confirmed that even council citizens were beginning to trust human-led frameworks more than their own governing structures, emergency doctrines were drafted contemplating containment. Yet each option collapsed under scrutiny because humanity was too integrated, too useful, too competent to isolate without unraveling the very systems the council relied upon, and so paralysis set in at the top, while momentum gathered everywhere else. And by the time the council formally acknowledged humanity as a strategic equal, the galaxy had already moved on, alliances had shifted, standards had evolved, and Earth had become a quiet reference point against which efficiency, fairness, and stability were measured. And in that realization, heavy and irreversible, the Star Council finally understood the depth of its mistake, that it had not underestimated a weapon or a fleet or a planet, but a way of thinking. And once that kind of shock takes hold, panic is no longer reaction. It becomes a condition, one that reshapes empires, rewrites history, and leaves behind a single undeniable truth whispered across the stars, that one planet of humans had changed everything simply by being better prepared for reality than anyone else. The realization that the council itself had become obsolete settled slowly but relentlessly, like gravity asserting itself after a long illusion of weightlessness. And while no official declaration was made, no banners lowered or titles revoked, the machinery of power quietly began to realign around Earth, not because humans demanded it, but because systems everywhere functioned better when human frameworks were involved. Trade stabilized faster, conflicts de-escalated more reliably, and technological standards interoperate with fewer failures. And this quiet efficiency terrified the remaining hardliners within the council far more than rebellion ever could, because it left no villain to rally against, no enemy narrative to weaponize. Only an uncomfortable comparison that humanity kept winning by simply doing the work better, and as the council attempted one final assertion of relevance, by proposing a sweeping reform charter that would reabsorb human influence under its authority. The response from Earth was measured, respectful, and devastating in its simplicity, pointing out redundancies, inefficiencies, and structural flaws with clinical clarity, accompanied by alternative frameworks already in operation across dozens of systems. Frameworks that were voluntary, transparent, and demonstrably more effective. And when several member worlds publicly declined the Council's proposal in favor of continued cooperation with Earth, the panic crossed the threshold into acceptance, because institutions can survive fear, but they cannot survive irrelevance. Meanwhile, humanity did not pause, did not gloat, did not accelerate recklessly, instead continuing its steady expansion capacity, education, and coordination, investing heavily in interspecies research teams, shared defense protocols, and disaster response systems that benefited allies and former rivals alike, embedding trust not through ideology but through reliability, and over time, even counsel. Loyalists found themselves relying on human logistical networks, human mediation channels, and human predictive models simply to function. And as generations passed, the memory of the Council's unquestioned dominance faded into history, replaced by a more distributed, resilient galactic order in which Earth served as an anchor rather than a throne. And when scholars later debated the moment everything changed, they did not point to a battle or a declaration, but to that first routine compliance. Demand sent to a single blue planet, and the calm, calculated refusal that followed, because that was when the galaxy learned that power had evolved, that strength no longer announced itself with fleets and fire, but with competence, adaptability, and foresight, and that one planet humans had shocked an entire star council into panic, not by breaking the rules, but by mastering them so completely that the old order could no longer keep up, a lesson written not in destruction, but in the quiet, irreversible shift of trust, influence, and authority across the stars, leaving behind a universe that would never again mistake humanity for something small. The final session of the Star Council was never officially recorded as such, because institutions rarely admit the moment they end, yet those present understood it instinctively. The chamber quieter than it had ever been, not from order but from resignation, as delegates reviewed reports confirming what they already knew, that enforcement capacity had eroded, that compliance was now voluntary at best, and that most interstellar traffic, arbitration, and crisis coordination flowed through human-led frameworks simply because they worked. And in that silence, panic finally burned itself out, replaced by a cold clarity, the understanding that the galaxy had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, and across Sol and its allied systems, humans continued their work with characteristic restraint, formalizing cooperative networks, codifying shared standards, and building institutions designed not to rule but to endure, systems engineered to absorb shocks, adapt to change, and function even when authority fractured, because humans had learned long ago that permanence was an illusion and resilience was the only real currency. And when the Council's last attempt at relevance came in the form of symbolic resolution acknowledging humanity as a co-equal partner, the response from Earth was polite, brief, and quietly final, accepting cooperation while declining hierarchy, making it clear that the future would be collaborative or it would not function at all, and that statement, more than any battle or threat, marked the end of an era, because the Council was built on vertical power, and humanity had introduced a horizontal alternative that scaled faster, adapted better, and inspired loyalty through competence rather than fear. And in the years that followed, the Star Council did not collapse in flames or war. It simply thinned, its chambers repurposed, its archives absorbed, its authority dissolved into history, while humanity became something unprecedented. Not emperors, not conquerors, but custodians of stability, a species that had shocked the galaxy into panic once, and then refused to exploit that fear, choosing instead to build systems where panic was no longer necessary. And historians across 100 species would later agree on one thing, that the moment the galaxy changed forever was not when humans demonstrated power, but when they demonstrated restraint, clarity, and preparedness on a scale no one had expected, proving that one planet of humans was enough to unsettle an ancient order, not because they were strongest, but because they were the most ready for reality. And from that lesson, burned deep into galactic memory, emerged a truth that would guide policy, diplomacy, and survival for millennia to come, that underestimating humanity was not merely a mistake. It was a structural failure, one the universe could afford only once.